Hello students, welcome back to CHRTC 309, Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so in the next few lectures, what we're going to be looking at here is the religious landscape, principally in Canada and the United States as it stands today. Just trying to get a better sense of where we kind of sit. In terms of youth, yes, but the religious landscape overall, just kind of trying to get to understand what it looks like, right? And what kind of environment young people are sitting in when it comes to religion overall. All right, so my suspicion is that these numbers will surprise no one. But basically, the story of kind of religious adherence and religious belonging in Canada and in the United States, really since sort of the latter part of the 20th century, has been one of sort of slow decline overall. Okay, so this basically is data here. If we're looking at it, is from 2011, right? So this came out from Pew Research Center. You can see Pew Research Center's little watermark at the bottom of the graphic, right, where they basically took information from the National Household Survey in 2011 and looked at the census data in Canada and basically said, okay, what's the change over time between 1971 and 2011? And what you see kind of in this data, and on the next slide I have updated data from the 2021 National Household Survey, is that from 1971 until 2011, a pretty steady decline across the board, right? So for the first little bit, if you look at after 1971, percentages of people who identified as Protestant and as Catholic basically stayed pretty stable for a little bit. And then, Protestant really kind of fell off, starting in like the late 1980s, early 1990s. And Catholic, again, stayed pretty stable for a while and then started to drop off as well. The other kind of story that we have here, right, other religions in Canada grew from 4% in 1971, a very small percentage, to 11% by 2011. But the really big story is the growth of the religiously unaffiliated, sometimes referred to as the nuns. We're going to have a big section on the nuns in a subsequent lecture. Growing from 4% of people saying they're religiously unaffiliated in 1971 to almost a quarter of people, 24%, in 2011. Okay, I mean, some of these numbers are a little bit messy, right? One of the things that unfortunately a lot of Canadian scholars have been really good at doing is disaggregating the data on Protestants. Protestants, I think, are more properly thought of in two major categories. Mainline Protestants, which belong to older Protestant traditions, typically you're thinking here Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, or in Canada called the United Church, and then evangelicals. Evangelicals belonging typically to newer churches, Baptists, or some breeds of Baptists anyway, Pentecostals, non-denominational churches. In Canada, you might see things like the Christian Alliance, and some of the biggest kind of evangelical churches, say in Edmonton, are Christian Alliance churches, right? And if you disaggregate these two, what you would probably see is that most of the losses have tended to come from the older mainline traditions, which are frankly speaking kind of in collapse, right? Yeah, I mean, basically about 12%, or about 4 million Canadians in 2011 identified as evangelicals, and that number, it's kind of bumped around. It hasn't had the same kind of big loss as say you've seen in the mainline Protestants. Yeah, I mean, if we looked, a couple years forward to 2016, Protestants tracked down from 27 to 20%, right? So in only a 5-year period, basically a 7% loss, which is rather extraordinary. Evangelicals stayed kind of flat in that same time period. Roman Catholics, right, fell from their kind of high of almost half the Canadian population in 1971 to 39% by 2016, they kind of stayed roughly flat, but we'll see, once we get to 2021, this story does change a little bit. All right, so a decade later, right, in 2011, and this data just came out last year, and I will say this was posted on Twitter by Sarah Wilkins Laflamme out of University of Waterloo, and I kind of, she posted them publicly, so I took her graphics because she did a really nice job on them. Okay, so what does it show 10 years later in Canada, right? Well, 10 years later, the decline of Christianity essentially continues apace, right? Okay, so what does it look like, right? Catholics, right? So Catholics, I said, kind of held steady, took a big drop, almost 10% drop from 2011 until to 2021. Now, part of that is also, just an increase in the Canadian population, right? And a big growth in other categories. But as we'll see, religiously unaffiliated, has seen a big jump as well. So yeah, basically, roughly speaking, there are 2 million fewer Catholics in Canada in 2021 than there were in 2011. Now, part of that is obviously attrition, right? You're going to have older people who identified as Roman Catholic who have died in that period, right? And that's especially going to be true in places like Quebec. Quebec, a very irreligious province, right? Very low rates of church attendance, but one in which at least the older part of the population continued to identify as Roman Catholic in large numbers. But as that older population kind of dies off, right, the silent generation and then the baby boomers start to die off, what we're seeing is that the younger generations in Quebec in particular are no longer identifying as Roman Catholic, even culturally. Now, this has been true since the 1960s, right, that it's been mostly a cultural Catholicism in Quebec, and other kind of French-speaking parts of the country. You could talk about, Eastern Ontario as having a lot of French-Canadian Roman Catholics as well. But the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, francophones, are no longer identifying as Catholic, right? They've dropped off the label. That cultural label has essentially fallen off entirely. So that is one really big part of the story. The other really big part of the story, obviously, is in the next kind of, essentially 5 categories or 6 categories there. The United Church, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, potentially the Baptists, and Pentecostals. I don't know why actually the Canadian census measures Pentecostals in the way it does. I actually have a few kind of issues with this because I think if you look at Pentecostals in Canada, they're much more likely, churches that call themselves Pentecostal, people are much less likely to identify as Pentecostal as they are just kind of generically Christian. So I think this is kind of a mistake. But nevertheless, and I think some of that decline in the Pentecostal number is probably just people who are moving from a category of, Pentecostal to, other Christian. But anyway, we can talk about that in due course. All right, what we see, right, with the United Church, right? 800,000 fewer members of the United Church, right? This is a church that's radically dying off. 6.1% in 2011, 3.3% in 2021. Same kind of story with, the Anglicans, not quite as big of a drop, but there's 500,000 roughly fewer Anglicans today than there were a decade ago. So they're dropping, and the percentages dropped, 2-ish%. Lutherans, never a big part of the population, right? And they've lost, 150,000. Presbyterians, down from 1.4 to 0.8%. And yeah, I mean, another, 171 odd thousand fewer Presbyterians. They're just dying off, right? These are traditions that haven't replaced themselves and haven't, passed down their religious beliefs to younger generations. Baptists, right? Not, 1.9% down to 1.2 and a loss of, roughly 200,000. And Pentecostals, right, less than 100,000 lost. And again, I think that one's a weird one. I actually wouldn't put Pentecostals necessarily right there. Um, I wouldn't even track them in the way that the census does if I was the one writing the question, but I'm not, so we sort of have to deal with that. Um, in terms of like positive or kind of neutral numbers, Christian Orthodox, so Eastern Orthodox churches, your Greek Orthodox, your Russian Orthodox, your Ukrainian Orthodox, Coptic churches, basically stayed flat as a percentage of the population and upticked, by less than 100,000 people. So they're very small, right? But I mean, at this point, more Christian Orthodox as part of the population than Lutherans or Presbyterians or Baptists or Pentecostals, not put together, but um, you know, individually. And yeah, I mean, their numbers are growing slowly. This is all essentially through immigration from other places in the world. And, I would guess we'll see that number increase again 10 years forward. Other Christian. Now, this is the really interesting one for me. Other Christian, basically is a grouping that includes what sometimes is referred to by sociologists of religion as the nons, right? So NONs, or non-denominational Christians. And these are people, I mean, they're essentially evangelical Protestants in theology. But one of the really interesting things that's happened, and we'll see this as well when we talk about the US, is that a certain segment of evangelical Christianity, and the only one that is really growing at the moment, has been these non-denominational churches. And they are essentially churches that are not aligned with any greater church body in any kind of reasonable or measurable way, right? They might be part of sort of movements, Pentecostal-ish in kind of their orientation, or Methodist, Wesleyan in their, and don't worry about the specifics of these theologies. It's not important for our purposes here. I only mention it. But yeah, like Wesleyan or something like that in their orientations. But each church sort of stands alone as almost an independent unit, not part of a larger body. Now they create sort of institutions that service things like the production of clergy for themselves. Um, but it's not like a distinctly, say, Anglican or Lutheran kind of seminary, and a lot of the people who end up, pastoring churches in this kind of non-denominational movement are very kind of easily, they move around very easily between kind of ostensible denominations, right? So I mean, I'll tell you, I have some friends who pastor churches in this kind of space, and moving from, say, like a Christian Reformed tradition, um, Calvinist, which has its roots in Europe and is a little bit more kind of liturgical, but then they'll easily move to, say, like a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church or a Alliance church, right? They can easily just apply for a job because there's no real denominational boundary that would be like, well, you didn't get trained as a Baptist or you didn't get trained as a Lutheran, and so, you have to like go through that process, right? So they're very kind of loose. Okay, what's the story here? I mean, obviously a 2% growth for other Christian, kind of as part of the Canadian population overall, right? The other Christian is bigger, I think, than all the Protestant churches probably put together at this point, right? There's more evangelical, non-denominational Christians than there are, other Protestants. Some people think this number might be people who are like transitioning towards the exit. So I will mention that. I'm not convinced by this, but people who have kind of burned out of institutional Christian life for whatever reason, and they say, well, I'm just Christian, but they don't attend church, and essentially they're headed towards the exit doors and headed towards no religion. Okay, so that's, a pretty strong, I think, growth if you're going to talk about any religious group that's growing. You're talking about adding over a million, 1,020,000-ish sort of people to this category. So I would say, given that most of the religious groups, well, Christian groups, especially in Canada, are declining in numbers, that ultimately this is pretty robust for growth, principally not driven by immigration. Now, the other possibility in this category is that as the mainline churches, right, United, Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Pentecostal churches kind of collapse, people may be sort of refugees into these non-denominational churches, right? Other possibility, right? A lot of churches like the United Church, Anglican Church, Lutheran Church, and Presbyterian churches have pretty massively liberalized on their theology, especially surrounding questions of LGBTQ individuals and their inclusion and the possibility of, say, things like same-sex marriage being performed in churches. And there is a percentage of people who are in those groups, the United Church, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, who don't like those particular theologies and who want to remain Christian, but then kind of head towards the exit doors and then end up in an essentially non-denominational church, which for the most part have not embraced LGBTQ people or same-sex marriage in the same way, right? Okay, Muslims, an interesting story there as well, right? Pretty robust growth of about 720 some thousand more Muslims 10 years on, going from 3.2% of the population to almost 5. And that, is driven entirely almost by immigration. Muslims in Canada as well do have, at least for the first generation, slightly higher birth rates than the average. That tends to level out over time. But the big number is being driven by immigration, right? And the places where immigrants are coming to Canada from today is a lot of places in the Middle East, North Africa, the Indo-Pacific, right? And places like Indonesia that have large kind of Muslim communities and Muslim majorities, right? So, we do see a lot of immigration. I guess Pakistan and places like Bangladesh as well, right? We do see lots of people coming from there, Somalia, right? So that is most of the growth, but then the slightly higher birth rate as well. Hindus, 1.5% in 2011 to 2.3%, so pretty robust growth, a little under 400,000 more Hindus. Sikhs, kind of same story, a 320 odd person growth, again, almost entirely driven by immigration. Buddhists, a slight decline. The number is essentially steady. It's about 10,000 less in 2021 than in 2011. It's not a huge decline. And I think the percentage decline is probably just population growth. People who identify as Jewish or Jews, down 0.1 and, a slight increase in their population. If you see, right, there's actually about 6,000 more of them than there were in 2011, but just not keeping up with the overall percentage of population growth in Canada. Indigenous spirituality, not even 20,000-ish, growth in Indigenous spirituality driven by, population growth and more Indigenous people coming back and identifying with Indigenous spiritual traditions. Indigenous people do have a slightly higher birth rate than the Canadian average on the whole, so that I think accounts for the growth there. And then other religions, right? So whatever isn't included in that, you could see, Druze, Jainism, there's other small religions that are almost, they're too small to measure individually, a slight uptick there. So that goes with the same story as Muslim, Hindus, and Sikhs, right? Principally driven by immigration. Okay, this bottom number though, no religion. And I know I've been going on this slide for about 15 minutes, but it's pretty significant, right? So that 24% number I was talking about on the last slide, right, in terms of people who identify as having no religion, that jumped pretty massively, right? It took essentially a 10% jump, 11% jump. And now over a third of Canadians identify as having no religion. And again, the causes here are relatively complex. But the growth there would be about 5-ish million, a little bit less than 5 million more people in Canada identifying as having no religion. Now, principally, that is people who have exited religion, right? And it's a long and kind of inexorable decline in a bunch of things, right? For one, a decline in Roman Catholicism, particularly in Quebec, right? Quebec, where for a long time people continued to identify as Roman Catholic, even though the odds that they had entered a church in the last 10 years were pretty slim, was sort of buoying that overall number of Catholics in Canada. However, younger generations of people in Quebec are less and less likely to do so, right? Basically, 2 or even 3 generations removed from the Quiet Revolution in Quebec that really severed the Roman Catholic Church from daily life in Quebec and changed the way people think about themselves as Quebecois, from principally thinking, well, we're Roman Catholics to we're French Canadians, and our real identity is as Francophones in North America, not as Catholics, relegated the Roman Catholic Church. Now, it kind of limps on for a while, right? Where people still identify with it, and it keeps the number of kind of Roman Catholics in Canada high for a bit. But inexorably, what is happening is that, divorced from the actual practices of Roman Catholicism in Quebec, increasing numbers of young Quebecers, or Quebecois, are not identifying as Roman Catholic. And this was inevitable, right? This was, if you don't live the religion, you stop identifying with it at some point, right? That cultural Catholicism of Quebec could only get you so far. Okay, so I mean, one of these, what I'll say is, some people have sort of treated this as like, oh my God, Christianity is collapsing in Canada. When it comes to the Roman Catholic side, Christianity collapsed in Canada a long time ago, right? For all intents and purposes, especially if you think about Quebec. The number of people who identify as Catholic has always been a massive over-report. It's always made Catholicism in Canada look much, much stronger than it actually is. When really, a lot of those people were non-religious, right? They just said, yeah, I'm Roman Catholic. Maybe they got baptized because that was a kind of cultural tradition in Quebec, maybe. So it kept the kind of official roles of Roman Catholicism going. And I mean, this is why, like, if you look at, the prelate structure, or where Canada has cardinals, right? So cardinals are high officials of the Roman Catholic Church. They're selected by the Pope. And one of the kind of places that has a cardinal in Canada is Quebec City. Now, does this reflect actual Catholics that attend church? No. Churches in Quebec have been shutting down for decades, right? And the buildings are being repurposed, they're being sold, they're being torn down. Because, from the 60s forward, people stopped identifying with their religion. Okay, so I think what's happening partially with this non-religion number is a lot of people that were non-religious, who were probably Roman Catholic, have started to just admit it, right? They're like, change their identification. There's no more cultural identification, particularly in Quebec and other French-speaking regions, to say I'm Catholic. People are just being honest. They haven't been to church ever. And so they're like, yeah, no, I'm not religious. I have no religion. I'm not Roman Catholic. I don't even know what that stuff's about. So I think this is a regression to reality, to be honest. There is also, increasingly less and less social pressure to be kind of a religious person, right? It used to be sort of expected that everybody had a religion, and so everybody would identify with the religion of your family. As we get more atomized, more individualistic, there's less and less of that social pressure, and so more and more people who were probably, we call this in sociology of religion, marginal peel-off. So people who were marginally affiliated with a religious set of beliefs, right? Maybe their parents grew up Roman Catholic and they attend church now and then, right? Maybe they went at Christmas and Easter. As there's less and less social pressure to have some kind of religious belief, people just kind of say no, I don't have any religion. Mainline Protestant churches, right, also are collapsing. And I mean, this story has been going on for a long, long time. Like I said, from the 70s, if we go back to 1971, right, it was like 89% of Canadians identified as Christian. And the collapse of the mainline Protestant churches has played a really strong role in that just complete collapse of Christianity, right? So I mean, we're talking very, very, very low percentages, identifying in those mainline kind of categories, right? So I think less than 10% now. Okay, so those churches collapsing, not replacing themselves, the young people that would have been born in those traditions are now probably being raised with no religion. And so that is the landscape, right? Fewer and fewer people attending religious services, particularly Christian ones, outside of evangelicalism or other Christian kind of categories. So yeah, I mean, we're seeing kind of broad declines across the board. The growth categories are principally driven by immigration, and we don't know how durable that will be, right? Will young people whose parents came here who are Muslim, will they remain Muslim, or will they themselves kind of move on to no religion at some point, or their children or grandchildren, right? So we don't know how durable, Islam or Hinduism or Sikhism is in a kind of multicultural Canadian society. I think that remains to be seen. Okay, so just to kind of drive forward what was on the last slide. So what we have here at the end, basically, is this. Just kind of the progression of different religious groups. I don't have them all here. I just kind of have a selection of them. Again, these graphics come from Sarah Wilkins Laflamme at University of Waterloo. But this just kind of shows you the progression of different faith groups in Canada over basically the period 1971 till 2021. So, that is basically a 50-year period. Okay, so what do we have? The first one here on the left, we've got the United Church of Canada. So the United Church used to be the second largest church in Canada after the Roman Catholic Church and the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. In 1971, it made up roughly 18% of the Canadian population, right? And in the subsequent 50 years, it has declined precipitously to about 3%, right? So when I talk about the decline in mainline churches, this is what I mean, right? It has basically fallen off a cliff, and at its current trajectory, it is due to just like disappear, just vanish within the next couple of decades, right? It simply will not exist as an entity any longer. The last person will die and someone will wander in to turn out the lights and the buildings will be repurposed into something else, right? Okay. Catholics, not as bad a story, right? 46% in 1971, down to 30% today. Again, on the last slide, I elaborated in great detail sort of what is going on there. Catholics are also buoyed a little bit by immigration from a lot of other parts of the world that are also Catholic, places like the Philippines, and chunks of sub-Saharan Africa that have large Catholic populations, Latin America as well, right? So there is some kind of buoying going on of Catholics, which probably is slowing down the decline, right? Otherwise, I think you'd see a much faster decline, but Catholicism being a global religion, a global faith, we are seeing a relatively slower decline. The United Church and a lot of mainline Protestant churches simply don't have that big global presence, and therefore, they're not able to slow the decline through immigration. And then, I've got Hindu, Sikhs, and Muslims, and basically, if we go back to the 90s, right, they weren't even on the chart. They would have been classed in other religions prior to 1991 when they were separated out on the general social survey because prior to that they were too small to measure. And we see, right, less than 1% each for Hindus and Sikhs, and 1% for Muslims. And with that growing, right, to 2.3%, 2.1%, and 5%. I mean, still altogether, the three largest, essentially non-Christian faiths only make up, 9.3% of the Canadian population. So still relatively small, but, growing really quickly. And this is, quite likely to continue, simply because immigration to Canada is going to continue as well. Okay, just to illustrate, kind of what I was talking about on the previous slide, right? We have, basically, this is what Catholics look like. This is just a picture of kind of Catholic decline across the country, right? And so we have our years in the gray bars, right? We've got our 2011 numbers. In the yellow bars, we have our 2021 numbers, right? Okay, so what we see, right, basically pretty clear, our Roman Catholics are pretty heavily concentrated in terms of numbers, like the Canadian population itself, in two provinces, Quebec and Ontario. And what we see, right, if we look at these, and I apologize that these graphs are in French, what we see is just a catastrophic drop, kind of like I was saying before, basically like a million, a little bit more than a million Roman Catholics, a drop of a million, in just in Quebec, right? And so this, I think, is really consistent with what we were seeing and what I was saying on the other graphs, right? That this decline is basically a failure of generational replacement for Quebec Catholicism, right? Basically, as the older part of the population dies off, and they were the ones who were sort of still identifying as Catholic, millennial and Gen Z Quebecers are not, so we're just seeing, boom, that number drop. So, I mean, I just want to really reiterate that this is not, I think, a million Roman Catholic people in Canada, or the 2 million or whatever, walking out the door, right? It's not like people just being like, puff, I don't identify as Roman Catholic anymore, and I'm going to change my affiliation. There's definitely some of that going on, but I think the bulk of what we're seeing here is essentially religious replacement, right? It's the replacement rate is not being met, right? Basically, young people are simply no longer identifying with this particular religion, right? They are just kind of stepping away from it, right? And so by the time they get to adulthood and they start being surveyed, they're just not there. They're not, they're not being picked up in the surveys. They're being picked up as non-religious. But it's not like, people who were sitting in the pews who were devout Roman Catholics are just like, harumph, I'm not going anymore. Okay. Like I said, there is certainly some of that. I think, you probably know, if you know any people who were raised Roman Catholic, people who walked away from the faith, and certainly I do. I'm not, but I think the bulk of it is just, you were raised Roman Catholic, and once you got to identify yourself as an adult, you simply stopped doing so. And then as, the older generation that still identifies dies off, basically the number just drops, right? Okay. Ontario, kind of a similar story in a way, right? But a much, look at that. There's a big difference in Ontario. It's not nearly the same kind of scale, right? We're talking about 300-ish thousand, a little bit more than 300,000 more Ontarian, or fewer Ontarians that are Roman Catholic, but the number, the drop is not what it is in Quebec. So that decline in Catholicism really driven by Quebec and everywhere else, right? Kind of, it's all in decline, right? With the exception, if you look at the second chart, of Nunavut, right? Where Nunavut has seen a percentage increase of 8.6%. Nationally, that's going to be completely insignificant because the population of Nunavut is so small, right? Compared to the whole nation, right? That you're simply not going to see Nunavut contributing a whole lot to a big kind of, it could increase 200% 200% more people in Nunavut could become Roman Catholic, and it's not going to affect the overall population on the whole. And I mean, everywhere else basically you see is in decline, right? Um, you know, uh, Terre-Neuve, Labrador, or Newfoundland and Labrador. So over on this side of the chart, a decline in 12%. You know, Prince Edward Island, a 12% decline. New Brunswick, a 16% decline. Uh, Nova Scotia, 17%. Quebec, right, biggest decrease there. Ontario, like a relatively modest decline. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, big declines, double digits. Alberta really, though, I'm always a little bit surprised because I never think of Alberta in a lot of ways as particularly religious. A pretty decent decline there of or a pretty small decline rather, 3.8%. I'm trying to think in French, what is CB? That's Territoires du Nord-Ouest, Northwest Territories there, 18% decline. Yukon, Colombie-Britannique, right? So BC. Sorry, that should have been obvious. Minus 10, well, almost 10%. It's still single digits, so, not leading the way. Although, I mean, BC, for lots of reasons, has always been a little bit less religious than the rest of the country anyway. But yeah, I mean, mostly what we see, all but three provinces and one territory, declines in the single or in the double digits in terms of Roman Catholic. So Roman Catholicism, in lots of ways, right, really struggling, not passing on that faith generationally, and clearly the attrition rate of people dying off or leaving the faith is higher than new immigrants who are Catholic coming in as well. So all interesting things I think to keep in mind right there. Okay, so again, this is just another way of illustrating the same data. This graph came from StatsCan. And I mean, what we see here essentially, is basically the same as what I was showing you. But, just with the bar graphs here, it kind of shows you the growth, right? And how much the growth has kind of jumped along and where it was comparatively, right? So Muslims, pretty small in the past, 2-ish%. And you see the growth. You see Sikhs and Hindus have also had pretty robust growth. Those lines are a lot bigger than in 2001. So relatively quickly they've grown. Jewish people, a kind of steady decline as a proportion of the population. Again, Jewish people don't have, for the most part, in a lot of parts of kind of Judaism, outside of Orthodox Judaism, don't have that many children. It's probably about close to the national average. And the only major source of immigration for Jewish people is Israel. And Jews, frankly, are more likely to move to Israel from Canada than the other way around. Buddhists, roughly in terms of proportion of the Canadian population, they're where they were in 2001, more or less. And then, other religious and spiritual traditions obviously is growing, but we don't fully know what's in there because it's a small kind of thing. And then, steady growth for indigenous spirituality. All right, this isn't just a Canadian story, right? So again, going back to numbers from about 2011 with Pew, the nothing in particular kind of category in the US was rising as well, religiously unaffiliated. Canada had risen faster, but the US was not far behind. And I mean, basically by 2016, the nuns, right, so nothing in particular, had surpassed Catholics in the US as the largest religious group at about 22% versus 20% for Catholics, right? So basically, and this number has more or less continued to rise since 2016. Now, what does this mean? We'll dig into that in a sec. But basically, both countries are undergoing, this process of people becoming nothing in particular or identifying as nothing in particular. It's just been much quicker in Canada. Okay, now what I will say here is that all generations that we are currently measuring, right? So the silent generation, those born between 1925 and 1944, the baby boomers born between 1945 and 1964, Gen X 1965 to 1984, roughly. I actually don't like that range. I would put it the Gen X ending at 1980, but whatever. And millennials, roughly 1980-ish till about 2005. All of these generations are essentially disaffiliating. Now, they all disaffiliate at slightly different rates. So, obviously the silent generation, their rates of disaffiliation have been much slower. They've been much more likely to remain religious. Though still some of them have moved to no religion. The boomers, kind of the same story, right? Now, a lot of the boomers don't necessarily attend religious services, but they continue to identify for cultural reasons. Gen X, a higher rate than the boomers, and then millennials, and we'll talk about Gen Z as we go forward here. Millennials have been the most likely to disaffiliate, and younger millennials, right, those born closer to the end of that range, have been the ones most likely to disaffiliate. So there's a strong generational component to disaffiliation, though essentially everyone is disaffiliating at the end of the day.